I never thought the most painful words I'd ever hear would come from my own daughter's mouth, spoken in the bridal suite of the most expensive hotel in downtown Charleston, while she stood there in a $4,000 wedding dress that I had worked double shifts for 6 months to help pay for. But there she was, my beautiful Sarah, looking at me with the kind of cold disdain I'd only seen her reserve for telemarketers and parking tickets, telling me that I would ruin her perfect wedding photos. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything I thought I knew about our relationship. 24 years of motherhood, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of driving her to dance recitals and staying up all night when she had the flu, of supporting her dreams even when they seemed impossible. And it all came down to this moment where she looked at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. My name is Margaret Chen, and if you had asked me 6 months ago to describe my relationship with my daughter, I would have told you we were best friends. I would have showed you the matching bracelets we bought on our last mother-daughter trip to Savannah, the dozens of photos on my phone of us laughing together at Sunday brunch, the texts she sent me every day asking for advice about everything from her job to her relationship with her fiancé David. I thought we had the kind of bond that other mothers envied, the kind that would last forever no matter what life threw at us. I was 52 years old, a single mother who had raised Sarah completely on my own after her father walked out when she was 3. I had worked as a nurse at Charleston General Hospital for over 20 years, pulling night shifts and weekend doubles to make sure Sarah never felt like she was missing out on anything. When her friends went to summer camp, Sarah went to summer camp. When they got designer backpacks for school, Sarah got designer backpacks. When she wanted to take violin lessons and then quit after 2 months to try soccer instead, I signed her up for soccer without a word of complaint about the wasted money. I had sacrificed my own dreams, my own relationships, my own life in so many ways to make sure Sarah had everything she needed to succeed. I never remarried, partly because I was too busy working and raising her, but mostly because no man ever seemed worth the risk of disrupting the perfect little world Sarah and I had built together. She was my whole universe, my reason for getting up every morning, my proudest achievement. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I chose to ignore. The way Sarah had started treating me more like a personal assistant than a mother over the past few years. How she would call me only when she needed something, whether it was money for rent or someone to watch her cat while she went out of town with David. The way she had begun to criticize everything about me, from my clothes to my hairstyle to the way I pronounced certain words. I told myself it was just a phase, that all daughters went through a period of being critical of their mothers as they established their independence. Even the engagement had been handled in a way that left me feeling like an afterthought. Sarah had called me 3 days after David proposed, not to share her excitement, but to inform me that they had already booked the venue and set the date. When I asked if I could help with the planning, she gave me a list of tasks that felt more like homework assignments than opportunities to bond over her special day. I was allowed to address invitations, coordinate with the florist about delivery times, and handle RSVPs from my side of the family. The important decisions about the dress, the menu, the decorations, the music, those were all handled by Sarah and David's family. David's parents, Richard and Patricia Wellington, were the kind of old-money Charleston elite who traced their family lineage back to the founding of the city. They lived in a historic mansion on Rainbow Row, belonged to the country club, and had connections that opened doors Sarah could only dream of. Richard was a successful real estate developer who owned half the commercial properties downtown, and Patricia was a former debutante who now served on the boards of various charitable organizations, mostly as a way to maintain her social status. From the moment Sarah started dating David 3 years ago, I could see how impressed she was by his family's wealth and social standing. She started dropping hints about expensive restaurants they had taken her to, charity galas she had attended, as David's guest, vacation homes in the Hamptons where she had spent weekends. Gradually, she began to distance herself from her own background, from the modest apartment where she had grown up, from the fact that her mother was a working-class nurse who had raised her alone. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself that Sarah was just trying to fit into David's world, that it was natural for her to want to impress his family. I even convinced myself that it was a good thing, that she was moving up in the world and would have opportunities I could never have given her. What I didn't realize was that in trying to fit into their world, Sarah was also trying to erase everything about her own. The wedding planning process had been a series of small humiliations that I had endured with a smile. When Patricia Wellington suggested that the rehearsal dinner should be held at their country club, Sarah immediately agreed without asking my opinion. When they decided to have the ceremony at the historic St. Philip's Church, where the Wellington family had attended, for generations I was informed rather than consulted. When Sarah tried on wedding dresses, she went with Patricia and David's sister Amanda, leaving me to see the final choice for the first time when she posted photos on social media. Every time I tried to voice an opinion or suggest an alternative, Sarah would get that look on her face, the one that said I was being difficult or trying to make everything about me. She would remind me that it was her wedding, her special day, and that she just wanted everything to be perfect. I began to feel like I was walking on eggshells around my own daughter, careful not to say or do anything that might upset her, or make her feel like I didn't understand the importance of the occasion. The financial strain was enormous, though. I tried to hide it from Sarah. She assumed that because I had agreed to help pay for things, the money was readily available. What she didn't know was that I had taken out a personal loan to cover my portion of the wedding expenses, that I was working extra shifts at the hospital to make ends meet, that I had canceled my own vacation plans and put off needed repairs to my car so that I could contribute to her perfect day. When Sarah asked me to help pay for her dress, I didn't hesitate to say yes, even though the $4,000 price tag was more than I made in a month after taxes. When she needed money for the photographer, the flowers, the wedding favors, I found ways to make it work. I ate ramen noodles for dinner and generic cereal for breakfast. I shopped at thrift stores for my own clothes. I turned down invitations to go out with friends because I couldn't afford it. Every sacrifice felt worth it because I believed I was investing in my daughter's happiness. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early and spent hours getting ready. I had bought a new dress for the occasion, an elegant navy blue number that I had found on sale at a department store. It wasn't designer, but it was beautiful and appropriate for the mother of the bride. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had my hair done at a salon, splurging on an updo that made me feel sophisticated and confident. I had even treated myself to a professional makeup application, something I had never done before, but felt was important for such a special day. I arrived at the hotel where Sarah was getting ready, my arms full of flowers for the bridesmaids and a small gift I had bought for Sarah to wear something borrowed from her mother. The bridal suite was a flurry of activity, with hairstylists and makeup artists working on Sarah and her 4 bridesmaids. Patricia Wellington was there, of course, directing everything like a general commanding troops, making sure every detail was exactly as it should be. Sarah looked absolutely stunning in her wedding dress, like a princess from a fairy tale. The dress was everything she had dreamed of, with intricate beadwork and delicate lace that caught the light beautifully. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate style with tiny pearls woven throughout, and her makeup was flawless. She was radiant, glowing with happiness and excitement, and for a moment I felt overwhelmed with pride and love for this beautiful young woman I had raised. I approached her carefully, not wanting to disturb the makeup artist who was putting the finishing touches on her lips. I had my camera ready, wanting to capture some candid moments of her getting ready, thinking these would be precious memories we would look back on together for years to come. I snapped a few photos of her laughing with her bridesmaids, of Patricia adjusting her veil, of the general chaos and joy that filled the room. That's when Sarah noticed me with the camera. Her expression changed instantly, her smile fading as she looked at me with what I can only describe as horror. She said something quietly to Patricia, who immediately came over to where I was standing. The room seemed to quiet down, as if everyone was suddenly aware that something was happening. Sarah turned to face me fully, and I could see something in her eyes that I had never seen before, something cold and calculating that made my stomach drop. She looked me up and down, taking in my dress, my hair, my makeup, and I could see her mentally cataloging everything she found lacking. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for whatever was about to happen. That's when she said it, her voice clear and steady, without a trace of the love or warmth I had always associated with my daughter. She looked me directly, in the eyes, and said the words that would change everything between us forever. She told me that I couldn't be in any of the getting ready photos because I would ruin them. She said the photographers were trying to create a cohesive aesthetic, that all the photos needed to match a certain style and quality level, and that my presence would detract from the overall vision they were trying to achieve. But it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. There was no apology in her voice, no recognition that her words might hurt me. She spoke to me like I was a vendor who had delivered the wrong flowers, like I was a problem to be managed, rather than her mother who loved her more than life itself. She didn't lower her voice or try to spare my feelings in front of the other people in the room. She just stood there in her perfect dress with her perfect makeup and delivered the most devastating blow I had ever received. The bridesmaids exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure of how to react to what they had just witnessed. Patricia Wellington looked pleased, as if Sarah had finally learned to prioritize the right things. The hairstylists and makeup artists pretended to be busy with their work, but I could feel their eyes on me, could sense their secondhand embarrassment at being witnesses to such a cruel moment. I stood there in my carefully chosen dress with my professionally done hair and makeup, holding my camera like it was evidence of some crime I had committed. I felt like I had been slapped, like the breath had been knocked out of me. This was my daughter, the child I had devoted my entire adult life to raising and supporting. This was the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who had asked me to read her the same bedtime story every night for 3 years, who had made me Mother's Day cards in elementary school, telling me I was the best mom in the world. I wanted to argue with her, to remind her of everything I had done to make this day possible, to ask her how she could speak to me that way in front of all these people. I wanted to tell her that I had worked double shifts for months to help, pay for that dress she was wearing, that I had sacrificed my own needs and wants so that she could have this perfect wedding she was so concerned about protecting. I wanted to ask her when I had become someone she was ashamed of, when loving her had become something embarrassing that needed to be hidden from her new family. But I didn't say any of those things. Instead, I just stood there, feeling smaller and more invisible than I had ever felt in my life. I nodded like I understood, like her request was reasonable, like it didn't matter that my own daughter had just told me I wasn't good enough to be included in the memories of her wedding day. I put my camera away and stepped back against the wall, trying to make myself as unobtrusive as possible while my heart broke into a million pieces. The activity in the room resumed as if nothing had happened, as if my humiliation was just a minor interruption in the important business of making Sarah look perfect for her big day. The photographers continued their work, capturing every detail of Sarah's transformation from bride-to-be to bride. I watched from my corner like a ghost, invisible and unwanted, while my daughter celebrated the most important day of her life without me. Patricia Wellington came over to where I was standing and put her hand on my arm in what I supposed was meant to be a comforting gesture. She told me that I should understand that this was Sarah's special day, that everything needed to be perfect, and that sometimes that meant making difficult decisions about what fit with the overall vision. She spoke to me like I was a child who needed to have adult concepts explained to her, like I couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated requirements of a high society wedding. I nodded and smiled and agreed with everything she said, playing. the role of the understanding mother who just wanted what was best for her daughter. Inside, though, something was breaking apart. Something that had been holding me together for 24 years was finally giving way under the weight of this moment. I realized that I had spent so long trying to be the perfect mother, so long putting Sarah's needs before my own, that I had forgotten I was a person who deserved to be treated with basic dignity and respect. As I stood there watching the woman I had raised treat me like an inconvenience, I began to see the pattern that had been developing over the years. This wasn't the first time Sarah had made me feel small and unimportant. It was just the most public, the most devastating, the most clear example of how she had come to view me. I was useful when she needed something, invisible when she didn't, and embarrassing when her new life required her to distance herself from her origins. The photographers worked quickly and efficiently, capturing every moment of Sarah's preparation with professional skill. They photographed her having her makeup touched up, her bridesmaids helping her with her jewelry, Patricia adjusting her veil one final time. They captured her laughing and smiling and looking radiantly happy, surrounded by people who fit the aesthetic she was so concerned about maintaining. I watched it all from my corner, excluded from the narrative of my own daughter's wedding day. When it was time for Sarah to put on her shoes, Patricia helped her, kneeling down to adjust the straps while the photographer captured the tender moment. When Sarah needed someone to hold her bouquet while she checked her appearance in the mirror, one of her bridesmaids stepped forward. When she wanted to take a final selfie before heading to the ceremony, she gathered her bridesmaids and Patricia around her, creating a perfect circle of perfectly dressed people who belonged in her new world. I thought about all the times I had knelt down to help Sarah with her shoes when she was little. How I had been the one to fix her hair when it got messed up. How I had been her go-to person for everything for so many years. Now I was standing in a corner like a piece of furniture, present but irrelevant, useful only for my financial contributions, but not worthy of being included in the visual record of the day those contributions had made possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had worked myself to exhaustion to help pay for this wedding, had sacrificed my own comfort and security so that Sarah could have everything she wanted. And now I was being told that my presence would somehow diminish the beauty of what I had helped create. I was good enough to pay for the dress, but not good enough to be photographed with the person wearing it. I was good enough to address invitations and coordinate with vendors, but not good enough to be included in the memories of the day I had helped orchestrate. As the getting ready portion of the day came to an end, I found myself wondering how we had gotten to this point. When had Sarah started seeing me as someone to be managed rather than someone to be loved? When had I become an embarrassment rather than a source of pride? When had the daughter I had raised to be confident and independent decided that independence meant cutting me out of the most important moments of her life? The group began to gather their things, preparing to head downstairs for the ceremony. Sarah looked absolutely perfect, every detail exactly as she had envisioned. The photographers had captured hundreds of images that would perfectly document her transformation into a bride, images that would be displayed in albums and frames for years to come. And in every single one of those images, there would be no trace of the woman who had made it all possible, no evidence of the sacrifices that had brought us to this moment. As we prepared to leave the bridal suite, I caught my reflection in one of the full-length mirrors that lined the wall. I looked good, I realized. The dress I had chosen was elegant and appropriate. My hair looked sophisticated. My makeup was professionally done. There was nothing about my appearance that would have detracted from Sarah's photos, nothing that would have ruined the aesthetic she was so concerned about preserving. The problem wasn't how I looked. The problem was who I was, where I came from, what I represented in her new narrative about herself. I was the reminder of her humble beginnings, the evidence that she hadn't always belonged to the world she was now trying to claim as her own. I was the single mother who had worked night shifts to support her, the woman who had shopped at discount stores and clipped coupons and made do with less so that Sarah could have more. In David's world, in Patricia Wellington's world, That kind of background wasn't charming or admirable. It was something to be hidden, something to be ashamed of, something that needed to be carefully managed so it didn't interfere with the perfect image they were trying to create. Walking down the hallway toward the elevator, surrounded by Sarah's bridal party but feeling completely alone, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided that I was done being managed, done being treated like an inconvenience, done accepting crumbs of affection from the person I had given everything to. If Sarah wanted to erase me from her perfect day, if she wanted to pretend that I was somehow unworthy of being included in her new life, then I would show her exactly what that choice meant. I thought about all the ways I could respond to what had just happened. I could continue to smile and pretend it didn't hurt, could play the role of the understanding mother who just wanted her daughter to be happy. I could swallow my pride and my pain and let Sarah have her perfect wedding photos without the inconvenient presence of the woman who had made them possible. I could go home after the ceremony and pretend that everything was fine, that our relationship hadn't fundamentally changed in that hotel room. But as we stepped into the elevator and I watched Sarah check her appearance one more time in the mirrored walls, I realized that pretending wasn't an option anymore. Something had broken today that couldn't be fixed with polite smiles and diplomatic silence. Sarah had shown me exactly how she saw me, exactly how much she valued me, exactly what she thought I was worth. And now it was time for me to show her the same thing. The elevator descended toward the lobby where the wedding guests were gathered, toward the ceremony that would officially welcome Sarah into the Wellington family, toward the moment when my role as the most important person in my daughter's life would officially end. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt something else rising up inside me. Instead of sadness, I felt clarity. Instead of resignation, I felt determination. Sarah wanted perfect wedding photos without me in them. She wanted to celebrate the most important day of her life without acknowledging the person who had made it possible. She wanted to step into her new world without carrying any reminders of where she had come from. Fine. I would give her exactly what she wanted, and in doing so, I would show her exactly what she was throwing away. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped out first, radiant and confident, ready to marry the man who would give her the life she had always dreamed of. Behind her came her bridesmaids, chattering excitedly about the ceremony ahead. Patricia Wellington followed, already taking charge of the logistics, making sure everything would proceed exactly according to plan. I was the last to exit the elevator, and as I stepped into the lobby filled with wedding guests, I felt like I was stepping into a new version of myself. The woman who had spent 24 years putting her daughter's needs before her own, who had accepted whatever scraps of attention and affection Sarah was willing to give, who had made excuse after excuse for behavior that should have been unacceptable. That woman was gone. In her place was someone I had forgotten existed, someone who knew her own worth, someone who refused to be treated as less than she deserved. Sarah thought she could rewrite the story of her life, could edit out the parts that didn't fit her. New narrative could pretend that the woman who had raised her was somehow unworthy of basic respect and consideration. She was about to learn that some stories can't be rewritten, that some people refuse to be erased, and that the love of a mother, when it's been taken for granted and thrown away, can transform into something far more powerful than she had ever imagined. The ceremony was beautiful, I had to admit. St. Philip's Church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, exactly as Sarah had envisioned. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floors. The guests were seated in neat rows, all dressed in their finest clothes, all there to witness Sarah's transformation from my daughter into Mrs. David Wellington. I sat in the front row on the bride's side, the place traditionally reserved for the mother of the bride. Patricia Wellington sat across the aisle in the corresponding position, looking regal in her pale blue suit and matching hat. The contrast between us was stark, and I wondered if anyone else in the church could see it as clearly as I could. She represented old money, established social connections, a world where image was everything, and authenticity was a luxury few could afford. I represented something else entirely, something that Sarah had decided was no longer valuable enough to acknowledge. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision, every moment choreographed to perfection. David looked handsome, in his tailored tuxedo as he waited at the altar, his groomsmen standing at attention beside him. The string quartet played Sarah's chosen processional music as her bridesmaids walked down the aisle in their matching champagne-colored dresses, each carrying a small bouquet of white peonies. Everything was exactly as Sarah had planned, down to the smallest detail. When the wedding march began and Sarah appeared at the entrance of the church, a collective sigh of admiration rose from the assembled guests. She looked breathtaking, every inch the perfect bride she had dreamed of becoming. Her dress caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, creating an almost ethereal glow around her. Her smile was radiant as she began her walk. Down the aisle, her eyes locked on David's face, filled with love and anticipation for the future they would build together. I watched my daughter make that walk, the most important walk of her life, and felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over me. Pride, certainly, because she was beautiful and confident, and everything a mother could want her daughter to be. Love, because despite everything that had happened in that hotel room, she was still my child, still the baby I had rocked to sleep thousands of nights. But underneath those familiar feelings was something new, something harder and more resolute than anything I had ever experienced before. As Sarah reached the altar and David took her hand, I made my own silent promise. I would sit through this ceremony with dignity and grace. I would smile for the photographers when they turned their cameras toward the congregation. I would participate in every tradition and ritual that was expected of the mother of the bride. But when this day was over, when the last dance had been danced and the last photograph had been taken, Sarah would learn that actions have consequences, that love without respect is meaningless, and that the person she had chosen to humiliate was far stronger than she had realized. The minister began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment, about the sacred bond being formed between two people who promised to honor and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. I listened to those words and thought about the promises I had made to Sarah when she was born, about the commitment I had shown to her for 24 years, about the honor and cherishing that had apparently meant nothing to her when she decided. I wasn't good enough to be included in her wedding photos. During the exchange of vows, Sarah spoke beautifully about finding her soulmate, about feeling complete for the first time in her life, about looking forward to building a family with someone who understood her dreams and supported her ambitions. David's vows were equally moving, promising to love and protect her, to be her partner in all things, to give her the life she deserved. The words were lovely, heartfelt, and completely devoid of any acknowledgement of the woman who had actually given Sarah the life that led her to this moment. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and David kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Sarah's face was luminous with joy as she turned to face the congregation as Mrs. David Wellington, her new identity officially sealed. The photographer captured every moment, every expression, every detail of her triumph. When she looked out at the assembled guests, her eyes passed over me as if I were just another face in the crowd, as if I were no more significant than any distant relative or family friend who had come to witness her special day. The recessional music began, and Sarah and David walked back down the aisle together, followed by their wedding party and then the immediate families. I stood and walked out of the church behind Patricia Wellington, the two mothers of the happy couple, though anyone watching would have thought Patricia was the only mother who mattered. She received congratulations and compliments from guests, accepting their praise for raising such a wonderful son and helping to plan such a beautiful wedding. No one mentioned the bride's mother. No one acknowledged my role in creating this day. No one seemed to realize that half of the person they were celebrating had come from me. The cocktail hour was held in the church's historic courtyard, where servers in white jackets circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while guests mingled and congratulated the happy couple. I found myself standing alone near a fountain, watching Sarah and David receive endless well wishes from their friends and family. They were radiant together, the perfect picture of young love and bright futures, and I felt like a spectator at my own daughter's wedding. Several people I didn't recognize approached me during the cocktail hour, introducing themselves as David's relatives or family friends. They were polite and well-mannered, making small talk about the beautiful ceremony and asking how I was enjoying the celebration. Their questions were cordial but distant, treating me like a peripheral figure in the day's events, rather than someone who had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment. When they asked about my relationship to the bride, they seemed surprised to learn I was Sarah's mother, as if they had expected someone different, someone who fit better with the Wellington family's image. One woman, an elderly aunt of David's, actually seemed confused when I identified myself as the bride's mother. She looked around as if expecting to see someone else, then said she had assumed Patricia Wellington was handling all the family responsibilities for both sides. When I gently corrected her, explaining that Sarah was my daughter and that Patricia was David's mother, she smiled politely and changed the subject, clearly uncomfortable with her mistake, but unwilling to acknowledge what it revealed about how I had been positioned in the wedding narrative. I excused myself from these awkward conversations and found a quiet corner where I could observe without being observed. From there, I watched Sarah work the crowd like a professional politician, moving gracefully from group to group, accepting congratulations and compliments with perfect poise. She had learned well from Patricia Wellington how to navigate social situations, how to make everyone feel acknowledged while revealing nothing of substance about herself. She was performing the role of the gracious bride flawlessly, but there was something calculated about it that I had never seen in her before. When the cocktail hour ended and guests began moving toward the ballroom for the reception, I took a moment to check my phone. There were several text messages from friends and colleagues who knew about the wedding, asking how the day was going and commenting on the photos Sarah had already posted to social media. Looking at those photos, I saw the carefully curated story she was telling about her perfect day. There were images of her getting ready with her bridesmaids, of her walking down the aisle, of her and David's first kiss as husband and wife. Every photo was beautiful, professional, and completely devoid of any evidence that the bride had a mother who had contributed to making the day possible. The ballroom at the Charleston Harbor Resort was decorated in Sarah's chosen color scheme of white, gold, and champagne. Round tables covered in ivory linens were arranged around a dance floor, each centerpiece featuring white roses and gold accents that caught the light from crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. The head table was positioned at the front of the room, elevated on a small platform so the wedding party would be visible to all the guests during dinner and speeches. I was seated at table 3, not at the head table with the immediate family, not at table 1 with the most honored guests, but at a table with David's extended relatives and family friends. The placement was clearly intentional, another subtle message about my importance in the day's hierarchy. Patricia Wellington was seated at the head table, of course, positioned as the primary maternal figure for the evening. My place card simply read, Mrs. Chen, as if my first name and my relationship to the bride were irrelevant details. During dinner, I made polite conversation with my table mates while watching the head table where Sarah and David sat with their wedding party and David's parents. They were clearly having a wonderful time, laughing at private jokes and raising their glasses in frequent toasts. Sarah looked radiantly happy, her face glowing in the soft light from the chandeliers, her new husband's arm around her chair in a gesture of protective affection. She belonged at that table, I realized. Belonged in that world of easy privilege and unquestioned entitlement. She had found her place, and it was a place that apparently had no room for the woman who had raised her. When it came time for the traditional toasts, David's father stood first to welcome Sarah into their family. His speech was warm and gracious, full of praise for Sarah's intelligence, beauty, and character. He spoke about gaining a daughter, about the joy Sarah had brought to their son's life, about looking forward to watching their marriage flourish. He thanked Patricia for her guidance and support throughout the wedding planning process, acknowledging her crucial role in making the day perfect. He did not mention me at all. David's best man followed with a humorous speech about their friendship since college, full of amusing anecdotes about David's bachelor days and his transformation since meeting Sarah. The maid of honor, Sarah's college roommate Jessica, spoke about their friendship and about watching Sarah find the love of her life. She talked about Sarah's dreams and ambitions, about her kindness and loyalty, about how perfect she and David were together. Again, there was no mention of the woman who had shaped Sarah into the person she had become. I waited for Sarah to stand and offer her own toast, perhaps to thank the people who had made the day possible, perhaps to acknowledge the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. But when she stood, champagne glass in hand, her words were focused entirely on her new husband and his family. She thanked David for being her perfect match, thanked his parents for welcoming her so warmly, thanked the wedding party for their support. She spoke about looking forward to being part of the Wellington family, about the wonderful traditions she would now be part of, about the bright future that stretched ahead of them. As Sarah concluded her toast and the room erupted in applause, I felt something inside me finally break completely. The last thread of hope that she might acknowledge me, might remember where she came from, might show even a trace of gratitude for everything I had done, finally snapped. I sat there clapping politely while my heart hardened into something I barely recognized, something cold and determined and utterly finished with being ignored. After dinner, the dancing began with Sarah and David's first dance as husband and wife. They moved together beautifully to a romantic ballad, gazing into each other's eyes as if they were the only people in the room. The photographer circled them like a shark, capturing every angle, every expression, every moment of their perfect beginning. When the song ended, David's father cut in to dance with Sarah, while David danced with Patricia, continuing the traditional progression of the evening's events. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, waiting for my turn to dance with my daughter, waiting for the moment that every mother dreams of at her child's wedding. But that moment never came. Instead, Sarah moved on to dance with David's grandfather, then with his brother, then with several of his friends who had served as groomsmen. Each dance was photographed, each partner was acknowledged, each moment was documented for posterity. I remained on the sidelines, invisible and forgotten, watching my daughter celebrate with everyone except the person who had made her existence possible. As the evening progressed, I began to notice other small slights and omissions that painted a clear picture of how I was being positioned in the wedding narrative. When the photographer gathered family photos, I was included in large group shots, but excluded from the intimate ones featuring just the immediate family. When guests asked about Sarah's background, David's relatives offered vague responses that focused on her education and career rather than her upbringing. When conversations turned to wedding planning, all credit went to Patricia Wellington and the professional planners she had hired. The bouquet toss was scheduled for later in the evening, and I watched Sarah's single friends gather on the dance floor in anticipation. Sarah stood with her back to them, holding the beautiful arrangement of white roses and baby's breath that I had helped pay for. When she threw it over her shoulder, it was caught by David's young cousin, a girl of about 20 who squealed with delight at the supposed prediction of her own future wedding. The crowd cheered and applauded, and the photographer captured the moment from multiple angles. What struck me about the bouquet toss was not who caught the flowers, but who Sarah looked for in the crowd afterward. Her eyes immediately sought out Patricia Wellington, sharing a smile and a knowing look with the woman who had become her surrogate mother. She looked for David, for her new sisters-in-law, for the bridesmaids who had supported her throughout the day. She did not look for me, even in that moment of tradition and superstition, when many daughters instinctively seek out their mothers. Sarah's gaze passed over me as if I were invisible. By 10 o'clock, I had made my decision. I had endured enough humiliation, enough deliberate exclusion, enough casual cruelty disguised as wedding perfection. I had fulfilled my obligations as the mother of the bride, had played my assigned role with dignity and grace, had given Sarah exactly the kind of seamlessly supportive presence she had apparently wanted from me. Now it was time to give her something else entirely. I retrieved my purse from the coat check and quietly made my way toward the exit. Several guests were also beginning to leave. The older relatives and family friends who had celebrated appropriately but were ready to end their evening. I blended in with this group, accepting their polite goodbyes and well wishes without correcting their assumptions about why I was departing. Let them think I was simply tired, simply ready to go home after a long and emotional day. As I reached the ballroom doors, I turned back for one final look at my daughter's wedding reception. Sarah was in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by her friends and her new family, her face radiant with joy and champagne and the intoxicating certainty that her life was perfect. She was everything I had raised her to be: confident, beautiful, successful, happy. She was also everything I had never taught her to be: selfish, ungrateful, cruel to the people who loved her most. I walked through the hotel lobby and out into the warm Charleston evening, my heels clicking on the marble floors, my head held high despite the devastation I felt inside. The valet brought my car around, and I tipped him generously, one of the last generous gestures I would make for quite some time. As I drove through the quiet streets toward my apartment, I began planning exactly how I would show Sarah what ruin really looked like. The first step was financial. Sarah had no idea how much I had sacrificed to help pay for her wedding, how much debt I had taken on, how much I had compromised my own security to give her the perfect day she demanded. She assumed that money was readily available to me, that my contributions were easy and painless, that I was happy to bankrupt myself for her happiness. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Over the next week, I methodically documented every expense I had incurred for Sarah's wedding: the dress, the flowers, the photography, the venue deposit, the countless small items that had added up to thousands of dollars over the months of planning. I gathered receipts, bank statements, loan documents, and credit card bills, creating a comprehensive record of exactly what Sarah's perfect day had cost me. The total was staggering, even more than I had realized as I was living through it. Next, I calculated the hours I had worked beyond my regular schedule to earn the money for Sarah's wedding expenses. The overtime shifts, the holiday coverage, the vacation days I had sold back to the hospital for extra cash. I added up the personal sacrifices I had made, the dinners I had skipped, the clothes I hadn't bought, the repairs I had deferred on my apartment and car. I created a detailed accounting of exactly what I had given up so that Sarah could have everything she wanted. Then I wrote a letter. Not an angry letter, not an emotional rant, but a clear, factual summary of what our relationship had become and what it would be going forward. I outlined the financial contributions I had made to her wedding, the personal sacrifices I had endured, and the treatment I had received in return. I explained that I was no longer willing to accept being treated as an ATM with legs, that love without respect was meaningless, and that she had made her priorities abundantly clear. The letter was businesslike in tone, the kind of communication one might send to end a professional relationship that was no longer mutually beneficial. I informed Sarah that I would no longer be providing financial support for her lifestyle, that I would no longer be available as her personal assistant and problem solver, and that she should not expect me to continue funding her choices while being excluded from her life. I was resigning from my position as her unpaid benefactor, effective immediately. But the letter was only the beginning. Sarah wanted perfect photos without me in them, wanted to celebrate her new life without acknowledging where she came from, wanted to pretend that she had achieved everything on her own merit. Fine, I would give her exactly what she wanted, and in the process, I would show her exactly what she was losing. I began by canceling every recurring financial commitment I had made to support Sarah's lifestyle. The monthly transfer I had been making to help with her rent, gone. The car insurance policy I had been paying for since she graduated college, canceled. The credit card account I had opened for her emergencies, closed. The family cell phone plan that included her line, terminated. Every automatic payment that flowed from my accounts to hers was systematically eliminated. Next, I addressed the wedding expenses that were still outstanding. The final payment to the photographer, which I had agreed to handle, remained unpaid. The flowers for the church, which had been delivered on credit with my guarantee, were now Sarah's responsibility. The gratuities for the various service providers, which I had promised to cover, would need to come from someone else's pocket. Every bill that arrived with my name on it was forwarded directly to Sarah's new address, with a note explaining that she was now responsible for her own expenses. I also began the process of reclaiming my own life. The apartment I had been living in was smaller than I needed and located in a neighborhood I had never particularly liked, chosen primarily because it was affordable enough to allow me to send money to Sarah every month. Now I could afford something better. I began looking at nicer places, apartments with better amenities and more convenient locations, apartments that reflected what I could afford when I wasn't supporting an ungrateful adult child. The secondhand furniture I had been using, kept. Because every spare dollar went to Sarah's needs, was replaced with pieces I actually wanted. The generic clothes I had been wearing, purchased at discount stores because brand names were a luxury I couldn't afford while funding someone else's designer tastes, were donated to charity. For the first time in years, I began spending money on things I wanted rather than things Sarah needed. I also made changes to my will and insurance policies. Sarah had been the primary beneficiary of everything I owned, set to inherit my savings, my retirement accounts, my life insurance payout, and any other assets I had accumulated. That changed. New beneficiaries were named, charities that aligned with my values, organizations that helped single mothers who were struggling to support their children the way I had struggled to support mine. Sarah would inherit nothing from me except the consequences of her choices. The most symbolic change was the photo albums. I had spent years creating beautiful scrapbooks documenting Sarah's life, from her first steps to her college graduation, carefully preserving every milestone and achievement. These albums had been intended as gifts for her future children, ways for them to understand the wonderful woman their mother had always been. Now they went into storage, along with all the other mementos of our relationship. If Sarah wanted to pretend I had never been part of her life, then the evidence of our history would disappear as well. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, Sarah began to notice the changes. The first sign was her rent payment, which bounced when the automatic transfer from my account didn't arrive as expected. Then her car insurance was canceled for non-payment, leaving her temporarily uninsured and scrambling to find new coverage. Her credit card was declined at a restaurant, embarrassing her in front of David and his friends. Her cell phone service was suspended, cutting off her access to social media and communication with her network. The calls and texts began immediately. At first, they were confused inquiries about technical problems with banking and billing systems. Sarah assumed there had been some kind of mistake, some glitch in the automated systems that managed our financial arrangements. She was busy with her honeymoon and the aftermath of the wedding, too distracted by her new life to immediately understand that the problems were intentional. When she finally realized that the changes were deliberate, her tone shifted from confusion to indignation. How could I cut off her support without warning? How could I leave her struggling with bills and expenses right after her wedding? How could I be so selfish and vindictive when she was trying to start her new life with David? The irony of her calling me selfish was apparently lost on her entirely. I did not respond to her calls or texts. I had said everything I needed to say in my letter, had explained my position clearly and completely. There was nothing left to discuss, no negotiation to be had, no compromise that would restore our previous arrangement. Sarah had made her choice about how she wanted to treat me, and now she was living with the consequences of that choice. The final straw came when Sarah showed up at my apartment unannounced, using the spare key I had given her years earlier, for emergencies. I came home from work to find her sitting in my living room, her face tear-streaked, and her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. She demanded to know why I was punishing her, why I was being so cruel, why I couldn't just be happy for her new marriage and continue supporting her the way I always had. Standing there in my own living room, looking at this woman I had raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before. Sarah was not upset because she missed me or valued our relationship. She was upset because her source of funding had been cut off. She was not there to apologize for the way she had treated me or to acknowledge the pain she had caused. She was there to restore the financial arrangement that had benefited her while costing me everything. I asked her to leave. When she refused, when she continued her tirade about my selfishness and cruelty, I called building security and had her removed. As she was escorted out, she screamed that I was ruining her life, that I was destroying her marriage, that David's family would never understand how she could have such a vindictive mother. The words she chose revealed everything about her priorities and nothing about her understanding of what she had done to deserve this response. That night, I changed the locks on my apartment and blocked Sarah's number from my phone. I also sent a formal letter to David's parents, explaining that I would no longer be contributing to any joint family expenses or celebrations, that they should not expect me to participate in future Wellington family events, and that any communication regarding Sarah should go through her directly rather than through me. I was done being the silent partner who funded their lifestyle while being excluded from their narrative. The next few months brought a series of revelations about just how much Sarah had been depending on my financial support. The wedding photographer demanded payment for the outstanding balance, threatening to withhold the final photos until the bill was settled. The venue required payment for damages to the ballroom that had occurred during the reception, damages that had been covered under my guarantee. Various vendors sent collection notices for services that had been provided with the understanding that I would be responsible for payment. Sarah was forced to take out loans to cover these unexpected expenses, loans that affected her credit rating and strained her budget. David's parents were horrified to learn that their new daughter-in-law came with so much financial baggage, debts, and obligations that they had known nothing about. The perfect image Sarah had worked so hard to create began to crack under the weight of reality. I learned about these developments not from Sarah, who had stopped trying to contact me directly, but from mutual friends and distant relatives who felt compelled to update me on the drama unfolding in my absence. They seemed to expect me to feel guilty about Sarah's struggles, to rush in and rescue her from the consequences of her actions. Instead, I felt a sense of satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. This was what ruin looked like, and Sarah had earned every bit of it. The most delicious irony was that Sarah's marriage, the relationship she had prioritized over everything else, began to suffer under the strain of her financial problems. David had married someone he believed was financially stable and independent, someone whose family could contribute to their shared prosperity. Instead, he found himself married to someone with mounting debts and a mother who refused to continue subsidizing their lifestyle. 6 months after the wedding, I received a call from Patricia Wellington. She was polite but firm, explaining that the family was concerned about Sarah's financial situation and wondering if we could work out some kind of arrangement to help the young couple get back on their feet. She spoke as if my support was something they were entitled to, as if I had some obligation to continue funding Sarah's choices regardless of how I was treated. I listened politely to Patricia's carefully worded request, then explained equally, politely, that Sarah was an adult who had made her priorities clear. If she needed financial assistance, she was welcome to ask for it directly, along with an explanation of why she believed she deserved it after the way she had treated me. Patricia was clearly not accustomed to being told no, especially not by someone she considered to be beneath her social status, but I was no longer the accommodating woman who could be managed and manipulated. The conversation ended with Patricia's promise to have Sarah call me to discuss the situation. That call never came. Apparently, Sarah's pride was more important than her financial security, at least for now. She would rather struggle with debt and damaged credit than admit she had been wrong and ask for forgiveness. I respected that choice, even as I recognized it for what it was, another demonstration of the selfishness that had characterized her behavior from the beginning. Meanwhile, my own life flourished in ways I had never expected. Without the constant drain of supporting Sarah's lifestyle, I found myself with resources I had forgotten I possessed. I moved to a beautiful apartment in a historic district of Charleston, complete with original hardwood floors and a view of the harbor. I bought furniture that reflected my own taste rather than what was practical and affordable. I traveled to places I had always wanted to see but had never been able to afford. More importantly, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of self-sacrifice. I took art classes and learned to paint watercolors. I joined a book club and made friends who valued my opinions and enjoyed my company. I started dating again, meeting men who appreciated the fact that I was independent and self-sufficient rather than constantly managing someone else's drama. I built a life that was entirely my own, free from the exhausting cycle of giving and being taken for granted. 1 year after the wedding, I received an unexpected visitor at my new apartment. It was Jessica, Sarah's former maid of honor, looking uncomfortable and apologetic. She had come, she said, because she was worried about Sarah and thought I should know how badly things were going. The marriage was struggling, the financial problems were mounting, and Sarah was beginning to realize what she had lost when she pushed me away. Jessica's visit was well-intentioned but misguided. She seemed to believe that if I understood how much Sarah was suffering, I would rush to fix everything, would resume my role as the supportive mother who cleaned up messes and solved problems, without asking for anything in return. She painted a picture of Sarah's regret and remorse, of sleepless nights spent wondering how to rebuild our relationship, of tears shed over the photographs that didn't include me. I listened to Jessica's plea with genuine sympathy for her position, caught in the middle of a situation she didn't fully understand. But I also listened with the clarity that came from a year of living my own life, of remembering what it felt like to be valued and respected rather than used and discarded. Sarah's suffering was unfortunate, but it was also the natural result of her choices. Consequences were not punishments. They were simply the way the world worked. When Jessica finished her appeal, I thanked her for caring enough about both Sarah and me to make the difficult visit. Then I explained that Sarah knew exactly how to reach me if she wanted to repair our relationship. She could start by acknowledging what she had done wrong, by taking responsibility for the pain she had caused, and by demonstrating through actions, rather than words, that she was ready to treat me with the respect I deserved. Until that happened, there was nothing to discuss. Jessica left looking disappointed but not entirely surprised. She had tried to play peacemaker and discovered that some bridges, once burned, require more than good intentions to rebuild. The person who had burned the bridge would need to do the work of reconstruction, and that work would need to begin with genuine accountability rather than manipulation or self-pity. As I closed the door behind Jessica and returned to my peaceful evening, I reflected on how much had changed since that devastating morning in the hotel bridal suite. I had learned that love without respect was not really love at all, but a form of exploitation dressed up in prettier language. I had discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behavior, even when the short-term consequences are painful for everyone involved. Most importantly, I had remembered that I was a whole person with my own worth, my own dreams, my own right to be treated with dignity and consideration. For too many years, I had defined myself entirely through my relationship with Sarah, measuring my success by her achievements and my happiness by her approval. Now I was learning to define myself by my own standards, to find satisfaction in my own accomplishments, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Sarah had said I would ruin her perfect wedding photos. What she hadn't understood was that she had already ruined something far more valuable, the relationship with the person who had loved her most. The photos would fade and yellow with time, but the consequences of her cruelty would last forever. She was learning that some kinds of ruin can't be captured in photographs, and some kinds of damage can't be undone with apologies or regret. The woman who had stood in that hotel room, absorbing the casual cruelty of her own daughter, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth, someone who refused to accept less than she deserved. Sarah had wanted to erase me from her perfect narrative, and in a way, she had succeeded. The accommodating, self-sacrificing mother she had taken for granted no longer existed. What remained was something Sarah had never bothered to get to know. The woman I had always been underneath all that unconditional giving, the person who had simply been waiting for permission to put herself first. That woman was not interested in being managed or manipulated or taken for granted ever again. She had learned what ruin really looked like, and she was no longer afraid of it. 2 years had passed since I had last spoken to my daughter, and I was living a life I barely recognized. My apartment overlooking Charleston Harbor had become a sanctuary of peace and beauty, filled with art I had chosen, furniture that reflected my taste, and most importantly, silence that belonged to me alone. No more midnight calls asking for money. No more crisis management sessions over problems that could have been avoided with better planning. No more walking on eggshells around someone else's emotional volatility. The morning started like any other with my coffee on the balcony, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. I had developed routines that nourished my soul rather than drained it. Small rituals that reminded me daily that my life was my own. The watercolor painting I had been working on sat on its easel in the corner, a harbor scene that captured the view from my window but interpreted through my own artistic vision. At 54, I was learning that creativity didn't end with child-rearing, that there were parts of myself I had never explored because I had been too busy managing someone else's life. My phone rang as I was getting ready for work, and I glanced at the caller ID with mild curiosity. It was a number I didn't recognize, which usually meant a telemarketer or wrong number. But something made me answer, perhaps the Charleston area, code that suggested it might be related to my life here rather than some distant sales call. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling with uncertainty. It took me a moment to recognize it as Sarah's voice, changed by time and circumstances in ways that made her sound younger and more vulnerable than the confident bride who had dismissed me from her wedding photos. She spoke my name like a question, as if she wasn't sure I would even acknowledge her existence after all this time. I said hello in return, keeping my voice neutral and giving her no indication of how I felt about hearing from her after 2 years of silence. The conversation that followed was stilted and awkward, full of long pauses and careful word choices that revealed how much damage had been done to what had once been the easiest relationship in both our lives. Sarah seemed to be searching for the right approach, the magic words that would unlock the door she had slammed shut with her cruelty. She told me she was calling because she had been thinking about me, missing our relationship, wondering if there might be a way to rebuild what we had lost. The words sounded rehearsed, as if she had practiced them multiple times before finding the courage to dial my number. There was something desperate in her tone, a quality I had never heard before, that suggested her life had not turned out exactly as she had planned when she chose to exclude me from her perfect narrative. I listened without offering encouragement or forgiveness, without making the conversation easier for her the way I had always done before. When she asked if we could meet for coffee to talk things through, I told her I would consider it but needed time to think. The woman who had once dropped everything to accommodate Sarah's requests was gone, replaced by someone who made decisions based on her own needs and timeline rather than someone else's urgency. After I hung up, I sat with the strange mixture of emotions the call had stirred up. There was still love there, buried under layers of hurt and disappointment, but it was a different kind of love than what I had felt before. It was love with boundaries, love with conditions, love that demanded respect rather than simply hoping for it. I had learned that unconditional love was often just another name for unconditional enabling, and I was no longer willing to love someone at the expense of my own dignity. The next few days brought more calls, each one slightly more desperate than the last. Sarah seemed to realize that her usual approach of assuming forgiveness wasn't working, that she would need to actually address what had happened between us, rather than simply waiting for time to heal wounds she had never acknowledged creating. The conversations gradually became more substantive, moving from vague requests to reconnect to actual admissions of wrongdoing. In our fourth conversation, Sarah finally said the words I had been waiting 2 years to hear. She admitted that she had treated me terribly at her wedding, that she had been selfish and cruel, that she had prioritized image over the person who had sacrificed everything for her happiness. She acknowledged that her behavior had been inexcusable, that no amount of wedding stress or social pressure could justify the way she had spoken to me in that hotel room. But even as she made these admissions, I could hear the careful calculation in her voice, the sense that she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear rather than expressing genuine remorse. When I asked her what had prompted this sudden recognition of her behavior, her answer revealed the truth behind her change of heart. Her marriage was falling apart, her financial situation was desperate, and she had finally realized that the people she had thought would replace me in her life were not actually there when she needed them. David had filed for divorce 6 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences, but really meaning that he couldn't handle being married to someone with so much financial baggage and family drama. The Wellington family had distanced themselves from Sarah once it became clear that her problems were not temporary setbacks, but permanent consequences of poor choices and entitlement. The friends who had seemed so important during the wedding planning had gradually disappeared when Sarah could no longer afford to keep up with their expensive social activities. Sarah was living alone in a small apartment, working 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet, struggling with debt and damaged credit and the reality of life without a safety net. The perfect world she had tried to create by excluding me had crumbled around her, leaving her isolated and overwhelmed. Now, she wanted to rebuild our relationship, not because she had suddenly realized my value as a person, but because she needed someone to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. The realization that Sarah's remorse was motivated by necessity, rather than genuine understanding of what she had done, was both disappointing and liberating. It confirmed that my decision to cut off support had been correct, that she had never valued me for anything other than what I could provide. But it also freed me from any obligation to respond to her crisis with the kind of immediate forgiveness and assistance she was clearly hoping for. I agreed to meet with Sarah for coffee, but I chose the location and set the terms of our encounter. We would meet at a neutral location, a cafe downtown that held no memories for either of us. We would talk for exactly 1 hour, no more, and she would have that time to explain what she wanted from me and why she thought she deserved it. Most importantly, I would make no commitments during that first meeting, would take time afterward, to consider everything she said before deciding how to proceed. The woman who walked into the cafe on the appointed day was almost unrecognizable as the radiant bride from 2 years earlier. Sarah looked tired, stressed, older than her 26 years. Her clothes were clean but inexpensive. Her hair was simply styled without the professional polish she had maintained during her marriage, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. She looked like someone who had learned that the world was harder than she had expected, that privilege could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. We sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and for the first few minutes, neither of us seemed to know how to begin. The easy familiarity we had once shared was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of strangers who shared a complicated history. Sarah ordered a plain coffee instead of the elaborate specialty drinks she had once preferred, a small detail that revealed how much her circumstances had changed. When she finally began to speak, Sarah's words came in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for months and could no longer contain them. She told me about the divorce, about David's family cutting her off, about the financial struggles that had followed. She talked about feeling alone and overwhelmed, about missing our relationship, about realizing too late what she had thrown away when she chose to treat me as expendable. But even as Sarah painted this picture of hardship and regret, I noticed what she wasn't saying. She wasn't taking full responsibility for the choices that had led to her current situation. She blamed David for not being supportive during difficult times, blamed his family for being judgmental about her background, blamed the economy and bad luck and everything except her own behavior. She wanted sympathy for her struggles without acknowledging that those struggles were the natural consequences of treating people badly. When I pointed this out, when I asked her to explain specifically what she thought she had done wrong and why it had been wrong, Sarah struggled to give concrete answers. She admitted that she had hurt my feelings, that she had been ungrateful, that she had made mistakes, but she couldn't seem to understand the deeper issues, the fundamental disrespect she had shown, the way she had reduced me to nothing more than a source of financial support, while excluding me from the emotional rewards of our relationship. The conversation that followed was difficult and painful, but also necessary. I explained to Sarah how her behavior had affected me, not just on her wedding day, but throughout the years leading up to it. I described the pattern of taking my support for granted while criticizing everything about me that didn't fit her new image of herself. I helped her understand that her treatment of me had been abusive, even if she hadn't intended it that way, and that abuse motivated by selfishness was still abuse. Sarah cried during parts of this conversation, and I could see that my words were genuinely painful for her to hear. But I also noticed that her tears seemed to be more about her own discomfort than about understanding the pain she had caused me. She was upset that I saw her behavior as abusive, upset that I wouldn't simply forgive and forget, upset that she couldn't just apologize and have everything go back to the way it was before. When our hour was up, Sarah asked desperately what she could do to fix our relationship. She offered to pay back the money I had spent on her wedding, though we both knew she didn't have the resources to do so. She promised to be a better daughter, to include me in her life, to never take me for granted again. She begged for another chance, for the opportunity to prove that she had learned from her mistakes. I told Sarah that I would consider what she had said and get back to her within a week. I explained that rebuilding trust would require more than promises, that it would need to be demonstrated through consistent actions over time. Most importantly, I made it clear that any future relationship between us would be built on mutual respect rather than the one-sided dynamic we had fallen into before. She would need to prove that she valued me as a person, not just as a source of support during difficult times. Over the next few days, I thought carefully about what Sarah had said and what she had failed to say. I considered whether she was capable of genuine change, or whether she was simply desperate enough to say whatever she thought would get her what she needed. I weighed my own desires for reconciliation against my hard-won understanding of my own worth and the importance of maintaining the boundaries I had established. The decision I reached was not the one Sarah was hoping for, but it was the right one for me. I called her at the end of the week and explained my position clearly and calmly. I told her that I was willing to have a limited relationship with her, but that it would be built on new terms that protected both of us from falling back into old patterns. First, Sarah would need to demonstrate genuine change through her actions, not just her words. This meant taking full responsibility for her past behavior without excuses or justifications, making amends for the specific harms she had caused, and showing consistent respect for my boundaries and decisions. Any attempt to manipulate, guilt trip, or pressure me would result in immediate withdrawal of contact. Second, our relationship would be rebuilt slowly and carefully, with clear expectations and consequences. Sarah could not expect financial support, could not assume that I would drop everything to solve her problems, and could not treat me as a backup plan when other relationships failed. She would need to learn to value me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Third, Sarah would need to address her own issues through therapy or counseling to understand why she had developed such selfish and entitled patterns of behavior, and to develop healthier ways of relating to people. I would not enable her dysfunction by pretending it didn't exist or hoping she would magically outgrow it. Sarah's response to these conditions revealed everything I needed to know about her. True motivation for wanting reconciliation. She was angry, accusing me of being punitive and unreasonable, of holding grudges and refusing to forgive. She complained that I was making reconciliation too difficult, that I should just be happy she was willing to admit she had made mistakes. She wanted the benefits of having a mother in her life without accepting responsibility for the relationship she had destroyed. When I remained firm in my position, Sarah played her final card. She told me that she was pregnant, that David's baby was the only good thing to come out of their failed marriage, that she needed her mother's support during this difficult time. She painted a picture of herself as a struggling single mother who deserved compassion and assistance, hoping to trigger my maternal instincts and override my rational decision-making. The news of the pregnancy was genuinely shocking, and I felt a complex mix of emotions upon hearing it. There was joy at the thought of a grandchild, sadness that this child would be born into such difficult circumstances, and concern about what kind of mother Sarah would be given her demonstrated selfishness and inability to consider other people's needs. But underneath all these feelings was a clear recognition that Sarah was trying to manipulate me, using her unborn child as leverage to get what she wanted. I told Sarah that I was sorry to hear about her difficult circumstances, that I hoped she would find the support she needed during her pregnancy, and that I would be open to discussing a relationship with my grandchild once he or she was born. But I also made it clear that her pregnancy did not change the conditions I had set for rebuilding our relationship, that bringing a child into the world did not erase her past behavior or entitle her to unconditional support. Sarah was furious when she realized that even the pregnancy card wouldn't work, that I had become someone who could not be manipulated or guilt-tripped into abandoning my own needs. She accused me of being heartless, of caring more about my pride than about my own grandchild, of being the kind of person who would let a baby suffer because of petty grievances with its mother. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, just as it had begun with her assuming that she could control the terms of our interaction. 6 months later, I received a birth announcement in the mail. My granddaughter, Emma Rose, had been born healthy and beautiful, weighing 7 pounds and measuring 20 inches long. The announcement included a photo of the baby, and looking at her tiny face, I felt the overwhelming love that comes with seeing your family's future in a new person. She had Sarah's dark hair and what looked like it might be my nose, and she was absolutely perfect. But along with the love came a deep sadness for all the ways this child's life would be complicated by her mother's inability to maintain healthy relationships. Emma Rose would grow up without her father, who had shown no interest in being part of her life after the divorce. She would grow up with a mother who had never learned to consider other people's needs, who expected the world to accommodate her, rather than learning to adapt to the world's requirements. I sent a card congratulating Sarah on Emma's birth and expressing my hope that motherhood would bring out the best in her. I also included a small gift for the baby, a silver rattle engraved with her name and birth date, something that could become a family heirloom if Sarah chose to value family traditions. But I did not offer the financial support or hands-on help that Sarah was undoubtedly hoping for, did not rush to fill the role of the doting grandmother who would solve all her problems. Instead, I opened a savings account for Emma Rose, depositing money that would be available for her education or other important needs, when she was old enough to make her own decisions about our relationship. I would not let Sarah's dysfunction prevent me from providing for my granddaughter, but I would also not enable Sarah's continued refusal to take responsibility for her choices by bailing her out of every difficult situation. The next 2 years brought occasional updates about Emma's development, usually in the form of photos sent by text message or posted on social media. I watched my granddaughter take her first steps, celebrate her first birthday, begin to develop her own personality through the limited windows Sarah chose to share. She looked like a happy, healthy child, despite the challenging circumstances of her upbringing, and I felt proud of her accomplishments even from a distance. During this time, I also heard through mutual acquaintances about Sarah's continued struggles and gradual growth. Single motherhood had apparently been the wake-up call she needed to begin addressing her own issues. She had started therapy, found a better job with more stability, and slowly begun to rebuild her life on more realistic foundations. She was learning, according to these secondhand reports, what it meant to put someone else's needs before her own, to sacrifice for someone you love, to find joy in giving rather than receiving. These changes gave me hope that Sarah might eventually become capable of the kind of relationship I had outlined 2 years earlier. But I also recognize that lasting change takes time, that good intentions can be undermined by old patterns, and that I needed to protect myself from disappointment by maintaining realistic expectations. If Sarah was truly changing, she would need to demonstrate that change consistently over time before I would be willing to risk being hurt again. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in spring when Emma was 2.5 years old. Sarah's voice was different this time, calmer and more mature, without the desperate edge that had characterized our previous conversations. She asked if we could meet again, explaining that she had something important to say that couldn't be communicated over the phone. There was something in her tone that made me agree, though I insisted again on setting the terms of our meeting. We met at the same cafe where we had talked years earlier, but the woman who sat across from me was fundamentally different from the desperate, angry person I had confronted before. Sarah looked healthier, more confident, more at peace with herself. She had gained weight in a way that made her look stronger rather than just heavier, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she had finally learned to see beyond her own immediate needs. Instead of rushing into explanations and justifications, Sarah began by asking about my life. She wanted to know about my work, my apartment, my hobbies, my friends. She listened to my answers with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that showed she was really paying attention to what I was saying, rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. It was the first time in years that I felt like Sarah saw me as a complete person rather than just a supporting character in her own story. When the conversation turned to our relationship, Sarah's approach was completely different from before. She didn't make excuses for her behavior or try to minimize the pain she had caused. Instead, she took full responsibility for her actions, acknowledging specifically how she had treated me and why that treatment had been wrong. She explained that therapy had helped her understand the patterns of entitlement and selfishness that had developed over the years, and how those patterns had damaged not just our relationship, but every relationship in her life. Most importantly, Sarah apologized not just for the wedding incident, but for years of taking me for granted, using me as an emotional dumping ground, and treating my love as something she deserved rather than something she needed to earn and maintain. She recognized that her behavior had been abusive, that she had caused genuine trauma, and that rebuilding trust would require consistent action over time rather than just words. Then Sarah did something that surprised me completely. She thanked me for cutting off support, for refusing to enable her dysfunction, for loving her enough to let her experience the consequences of her choices. She explained that losing my financial safety net had forced her to develop skills and strength she never knew she possessed, that struggling as a single mother had taught her empathy and resilience, that hitting rock bottom had been necessary for her to begin building a better life. She talked about Emma and how becoming a mother had changed her perspective on everything, especially on the sacrifices I had made throughout her childhood. She could now understand what it meant to love someone more than yourself, to worry constantly about another person's well-being, to find joy in someone else's happiness. She realized that I had been doing all of these things for her for 24 years, and that she had not only failed to appreciate it, but had actively punished me for caring about her. When Sarah finished speaking, we sat in comfortable silence. For the first time in years, I could see that her words were genuine, that they came from real understanding rather than strategic calculation. She had finally learned what I had been trying to teach her through my absence, that relationships require mutual respect, that love without appreciation becomes meaningless, and that some bridges can only be rebuilt by the person who burned them down. I agreed to begin the slow process of rebuilding our relationship, but I also made it clear that this would happen on my terms and timeline. Sarah would need to continue demonstrating her growth through actions, would need to respect my boundaries without argument, and would need to accept that our relationship would never return to the codependent dynamic we had fallen into before. She agreed to these conditions with genuine enthusiasm, understanding that they were protective rather than punitive. Over the following months, Sarah proved that her change was real through consistent behavior. She called regularly, but respected my schedule, never demanding immediate attention or assuming I would drop everything for her convenience. She asked for advice, but accepted when I declined to solve her problems for her, working through challenges independently while appreciating the emotional support I was willing to provide. Most importantly, she included me in her life because she valued my presence, not because she needed my resources. The first time I met Emma Rose in person was magical in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. She was a delightful child, curious and affectionate, with Sarah's intelligence and what I hoped might be some of my determination. Watching Sarah interact with her daughter revealed how much she had truly changed, how she had learned to be patient and selfless and completely devoted to someone else's well-being. The selfish young woman who had excluded me from her wedding photos had become a loving mother who understood what real sacrifice looked like. As Emma and I got to know each other, I began to see possibilities for the future that I had thought were lost forever. This little girl would grow up knowing her grandmother, would benefit from the wisdom and love I had to offer, would understand that family relationships could be based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The savings account I had opened for her would help with her education, but more importantly, she would have access to the emotional support and guidance that every child deserves. Sarah and I established new traditions that honored both our past and our future. We celebrated Emma's milestones together, created photo albums that included all 3 generations, and slowly built memories that would replace the painful ones from before. The process was gradual and sometimes difficult, but it was also deeply rewarding in ways that our previous relationship had never been. Now, 5 years after that devastating day in the hotel bridal suite, I can honestly say that I am grateful for everything that happened. Sarah's cruelty had been necessary to break the dysfunctional patterns we had fallen into, to force both of us to examine what we really valued and what kind of relationship we wanted to have. The pain had been enormous, but it had also been transformative, leading us both to become better versions of ourselves. The woman who had been told she would ruin the perfect wedding photos had learned that some things are more important than perfect images. The daughter who had thought she could erase her past had learned that authentic relationships require accepting all parts of yourself and the people you love. We had both discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior, even when the short-term consequences are devastating. Sarah never got her perfect wedding photos without me in them, because her marriage didn't survive long enough to display them. But she got something far more valuable in the end, a real relationship with her mother, built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation. Emma Rose will grow up seeing what healthy family dynamics look like, understanding that love requires effort and consideration, knowing that she is valued for who she is rather than what she can provide. I learned that showing someone what ruin Looks like isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about refusing to participate in your own devaluation, about insisting on being treated with dignity, about demonstrating that actions have consequences. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop accepting unacceptable behavior, even when that person is your own child. The perfect wedding photos Sarah was so concerned about protecting are probably stored somewhere in a box, forgotten. Reminders of a relationship that couldn't survive the reality of who she was at the time. But the imperfect, authentic photos we take now, with Emma Rose between us and genuine smiles on all our faces, those are the ones that will be treasured for generations. They tell the real story of what family can be when it's built on love that demands respect, forgiveness that requires accountability, and hope that has been earned through genuine change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.